Hello, and I'd like to welcome you to the I3 lecture series hosted by the Masters in Digital Photography Department at the School of Visual Arts. We are thrilled to have photographer Arlene Gottfried as tonight's guest speaker. Brooklyn-born and a graduate of the Fashion Institute of Technology, Arlene worked as a photographer at an ad agency before freelancing for top publications such as the New York Times, Fortune, Life, and The Independent. She has exhibited at the Leica Gallery in both New York and Tokyo, and at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., among many others. Her work is included in the collections of the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the New York Public Library, and the Maison Européenne de la Photographie in Paris. Arlene is the author of 4 monographs: Bacalaitos Fireworks, Powerhouse, 2011, Sometimes Overwhelming, also from Powerhouse, 2008, Midnight, also from Powerhouse, 2003, and The Eternal Light, Dewey Lewis, 1999. As a matter of fact, Arlene brought a few copies of her books tonight, not many, a few, and if anybody's interested in purchasing, they will be available after the lecture. What a resume cannot begin to spell out is the sometimes overwhelming and great intimacy, humanity, sense of humor that this native New Yorker brings to the table when she photographs her city. So please help me welcome Arlene Gottfried to our lecture series.
Thank you, Jaime, for inviting me to speak tonight, and thank you all for being here this evening. I'm just going to start, since he mentioned sometimes overwhelming. That's the black and white work I'm going to begin showing you. That actually I shot over the years in the 70s and 80s, and these pictures were just in boxes. And until I happened to meet a young woman named Maria Mayer who said, I love these black and white, and I put books together. And she worked on the book, and that's how it got born. I'd never thought much of having the work or that it would ever wind up anywhere except it boxes, you know, in storage someplace. So this book came out in 2008. These are all long-term projects that have lasted over several years at least. This one I call Angel and Woman on the Boardwalk in Brighton. Actually, he was a friend of mine from my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and we went to the beach together, and I wound up taking this picture. Staten Island, baby with a paper bag on her head. Also, I would just go places that were interesting to me. And Staten Island always seemed to be a place like no other, that you just took a ferry and you were in another world. Actually, I wound up moving into Westbeth. This is from the early Halloween parade that began. An artist, Ralph Liu, a puppeteer, began the parade way back when in the 70s. And a friend told me about it, and we went over there, and it was really a small, charming parade. And now it's kind of, well, you know what it's like. It's huge. It's a Mardi Gras. Times Square. I just met this man sitting there, and I asked if I could take his picture. This is this isn't New York City, actually. It's a Connecticut wedding that I got invited to. Someone I worked with when I was at the ad agency. This was interesting. A friend of mine who was a writer, she is still a writer, and told me that she wanted to do a story on speculation, and this was called the Rikers Island Olympics, of all things, and they had an Olympics on Rikers Island. And this is one of my favorite pictures that I got, but it was a pretty wild day there. These things that you don't know about or don't expect to be happening. This is from Purim in Borough Park. And I took a lot of pictures then, but this is my favorite, through the car window. Central Park Zoo. This is actually the butcher boy, the son of the butcher in the freezer. And I think it's one of my earliest published pictures that was in the family of children. That was an offshoot of the family of man. Couple on the highway. This is my mother and my grandmother on Delancey Street. My grandmother used to come and visit, and she used to take the bus back from Delancey and Essex. I think over the bridge, or maybe she took the train. I can't remember exactly. And they always used to kiss goodbye, and I always used to try to get that photograph of them. Roseland, the Great Ballroom. This was taken in Spanish Harlem. Tompkins Square Park. I just saw this woman sitting there, and I asked her if I could take her picture. She was very agreeable. This is back in 1980, way before Photoshop. The funny thing about this was it was a very hot day, and there was Reese Beach was a nude bay, Bay 1, way back then, and the neighbors didn't like it very much. It's all these people coming down to sunbathe naked, and they finally got rid of it. But like an apparition, all of a sudden this Hasidic man shows up, and could you imagine in the hot sunlight, here comes this man all in black over the sand, and so everybody gathered around him because it was so peculiar. And then the Muslim man comes over and says, "Take a picture of me with him because I'm Jewish too." So that's my favorite story, and it's on its truth and honesty. This was also taken at Reese. This is Patuca from the Puerto Rican Day Parade, taken around Bethesda Fountain. Back to Coney Island. This is at the Eternal Light. It actually was my first book. It was a project that I clearly believe was meant to happen when I met the gospel choir, Selwyn Rawls, and the Eternal Light community singers. I saw them on the Lower East Side at a gospel fest they had at the place called the Gas Station. It was a performance place on 2nd Street and Avenue B. Before the neighborhood got so gentrified. It was a former broken down gas station that they turned into performance art. And there was a gospel concert, and I stayed there just sitting there, and there were a lot of little groups coming on. And then towards the end of the day, this mass choir arrives, and they all get up on the stage, and their sound was so intense. I was sitting in the back just relaxing, and then I had to come to the front because they were so powerful. This is little Monet Fleming at 2 years old. I photographed her on a Saturday night at Erasmus Hall. That was my high school in Brooklyn. And on Monday, she had been hit by her mother's boyfriend, and she passed away. But her young life touched me and changed my life completely, as did the whole choir. But it's because of this incident that I went back, and I went to her funeral, and I gave her mother, she asked me for the last pictures that were ever taken of her. This is her mother being consoled by another choir member. This is Selwyn and the Eternal Light at their live recording. They had a live recording shortly after I met them. I think it was in October of 1990, actually. Wow, time really flies. But the live recording, it was all like nothing I ever experienced before. Very passionate, very big sound, and I loved it. I fell in love with them. This came out of a shoot they asked me to do because they wanted a picture for their album cover, and my picture never got used, but this picture came out of the shoot that we did in the church. This is Charles and his son Leon, who must be a grown man by now, but we took this picture at an appreciation service when somebody's being honored at their church by family and friends. And as is this one, the Eternal Lights Appreciation by Selwyn Rawls. Everybody gets super dressed up for that. This was a dear friend. Certain people I became very close to, and this was a dear friend of mine, Jeffrey Lucas, who's fixing his mother's flowers for her birthday. He lived in Coney Island. I used to love to go visit out there and take pictures and just hang out with them. It was very enjoyable to me. And he's a great soloist, so I was very inspired by his singing. As is Tasha. This is Tasha. Her singing was unbelievable. A really masterful soloist in gospel music. And this woman too, Monique Walker, I took this at the wedding, a wedding that I'll never forget ever, the intensity of it and the music. Instead of having food like most people do at a wedding, they had a concert. And it was really beautiful. Latasha at home. Then after a while, well, I'm forgetting to tell it, but the choir, the same force that pulled me to them to photograph them pulled me further, and one day I stood up when they were called to sing in the church, and I stood up and I tried to sing with them, and it was a long process of being able to sing that way with all your might and everything you have, because Selwyn would pull it out of you. It had to be like, they call it giving it your all. You'd have to give all of yourself. And the way the feeling was in the sanctuary anyway, you wanted to give your all. So I finally learned how to have, by singing there and going weekly to the Tuesday night rehearsals and going to the churches on the weekends, I developed the big voice to sing with them, and that was a great pleasure for me, and an honor. I felt it was an honor to be accepted and to be able to do that, and all the people I met from the different churches all around New York and Brooklyn, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and we also went on long bus rides to Detroit, North and South Carolina. Those were amazing trips. I can't see myself doing that. But it was really amazing, and the closeness and camaraderie that all the members had, it's hard to describe. This picture was in the New York Times when they had that section called What Were They Thinking? I was photographing Jeffrey's wedding, and we went back to his house after the wedding, and I was taking some more pictures, and I got this, and it got published in the Sunday magazine. On one of the buses we were going to Long Island at this particular Saturday evening in a rickety bus, the kind of buses you see in Mexico, like third class, and they were all embarrassed by it because it had decorations, and it was like an old school bus, and they didn't want to really ride on that kind of bus, but it was still fun. We always had a lot of fun. Bacalaitos and Fireworks, that was my book from 2011. This also was like a passion of mine for about 20 years. I was very involved and connected to the Puerto Rican community, the artists, the people who lived on the Lower East Side and wherever. I used to go everywhere, the parade, block parties. Ward's Island, you name it, when there was a religious event or whatever it was, I was there. A lot of times going with the people I knew from the New Eurekan Poets Cafe. This picture, I was in El Barrio, Spanish Harlem, and I met this family outside, and they were celebrating the baptism of their little girl. And this was her cousin, and it was a time close to Halloween. So that's why she put the mask on, and that really makes the picture. Also, this was a family friend. They lived in Brooklyn, and they put the baby down for an instant on the chair, and that's just how the albums were left on the chair. So, East 7th Street, I was walking on a Saturday, and this is exactly what I saw, them barbecuing the pig. El Pico, from the early days of the Puerto Rican Day Parade. Parade just happened recently, 2 weeks ago. And it was easier to take photographs earlier on because you could back up a little bit. Now it's pretty crowded, so I haven't gone in a while. This one, the Lower East Side, I actually started out on a Sunday afternoon, and I was walking around looking for a friend of mine. And I didn't really know what I was going to do. It was summer and the Sunday, and it's quiet. So I saw this procession of girls that have gotten their communion. And I just thought, well, I'll hang out with them and I'll go where they're going. And that's how I got this picture. Cousins on Eldridge Street. Be My Valentine, also on the Lower East Side. Dancing in Tompkins Square Park to a salsa band was up there. This was back at Bethesda Fountain. I just saw this family. I saw them 1 week, and I think I had gone back to the park, and I saw them again. And there's somewhere there's just an okay black and white of them, but this is much better picture, I think, anyway. Back then in the 80s was a terrible plague of drugs on the Lower East Side. It was an open-air drug market, and it was very, very bad. And I was able to do this. I knew some people that were involved in that world, and I went with them. And this guy was actually underneath a building, a tenement around Eldridge Street, and that's what they used to do. Just get high as much as they could. And then my favorite thing is that once a while back I was walking on Delancey Street and the Bowery, and there was a big billboard there that said, "Where have all the junkies gone?" And I thought that's an amazing thing, because first they were everywhere and everything was so decrepit, and then you didn't see them anymore. And the area, well, it's pretty gentrified now, 2015. My dear friend, the poet and playwright Miguel Pinheiro, the actor, he was in the movie Fort Apache, The Bronx, and he said, well, I'm going to be in a movie and the buses are leaving from the Time Life building. So I went and got on the bus. And it was an interesting day of filming out there. Reciting the poetry at an underground club that was on the Lower East Side on East 6th Street. There was a bookstore called Neither Nor on 6th Street for a long time. This is Miguel Algarín, the poet, who is eulogizing he was a conga player and he passed away, Richie Cruz. These pictures are of midnight, just the same as most of my work. I don't really think ahead of time of what I'm doing. I don't really do a lot of planning. And I met Midnight at the New Eurekan Poets Cafe, and we became friends. That was in 1984. And only when my freelance work slowed down to a crawl, I was doing a lot of freelance for different magazines. And then it got really slow, so I thought, well, let me look at the Midnight pictures, because they were in a shoebox and, you know, on a shelf. And I started to look at them, and then at that time, it was laser copies, and I made a bunch of those, and then I started showing them to some people at some meetings and festivals, and you know, some of them would start to cry when I told his story, so I realized that I had a project that was publishable. And these are the early pictures of Midnight in '84. He also danced at that club where Pinheiro was reading the poetry. Halloween. He went into a faraway place, and he was non-communicative, and I didn't know what was wrong with him. And then later on, he disappeared, and he came to my house, and he had a costume on of scarves, and he was carrying a stick, and he was saying things that were really nonsensical. He's going to walk to Canada and all this, and I was very frightened. And then he was up on top of the Williamsburg Bridge, and the police said they were taking him to Bellevue, and that's when he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. That's the old Bellevue Hospital. So I spoke to him a few weeks ago, or maybe it was a longer time ago than that, but we still talk sometimes. And this was his sister's funeral. She died of AIDS, and these were her children that were left. Second Avenue. He was living in a residency for people with mental illness, and I went to visit him in Queens. They call them shared apartments because it's between two people usually only live there, one or two. He had a sense of humor, though, and aside from everything, and a keen perception that was almost like being a psychic, or you know, in spite of his illness, or maybe because of it, I really don't know. His doctor gave him some fancy clothes. These are some pictures that I took of my mother. And the only color picture I took of my father when I was starting to shoot very early on. Probably this picture was taken in '72, I would guess. In her kitchen. This is my grandmother. She lived in Brooklyn. My sister. My mother lived in the building on Avenue A and 4th Street in the Lower East Side. This is my grandmother's other apartment when she had to move out of the one that got too bad. Visiting again, I said she liked to visit us. She would be very independent and take 2 buses and a train to come into Manhattan. This was how 14th Street and 1st Avenue used to look. There were a lot of these funny furniture stores that were big gaudy furniture covered in plastic and tables to match, and as if you were a king or a queen living in a palace. But I used to enjoy all that, and I miss it. It was so quirky and funny. I used to, and good things to look at when you're kind of walking around. I find it a bit dull now, actually. Everything is a little too homogenized for my taste. My sister and I went to an old bungalow colony in the Catskills way back. My mother had developed bad diabetes and it affected her eyes. This picture of my grandmother putting on her stockings is in the collection of the Jewish Museum. And this picture was published in a book that somebody came up with the title, Grandmothers of Women Photographers. I don't know whatever happened to that book, except that I know I have one somewhere. She loved ice cream. Coming back from a doctor visit, getting the change ready for the bus. Swimming pool. That's the picture of my grandmother holding a picture of her parents. My mother, when her health started to deteriorate worse than it had been. And my sister at her funeral. And my sister decided not that that shouldn't be the end of, but the beginning, and she had a baby. Later in life, she decided to have a baby. And that's him. He's 10 now. Thank you very much. That's the slideshow for now. If you have any questions or...
Hi, Arlene.
Hi, Ruben.
Arlene, how are you? I have a question regarding the photo of the procession, the communion procession. Yeah. That television is on, right?
Yeah.
It was plugged to the car or it was plugged
Not
to
the
where?
car. They used to plug into the light, the light on the street. They'd open it and find a way to hook
to the
up
lamppost.
the lamppost.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Because every time I saw it, I'm like, okay, I need to figure that out because you can't do that now, obviously.
No, but they always had a way of making things work outside,
That photo always
for
stays with me, no matter. I mean, I love all your work, but that photo is always the one that I always go back to because I guess it's one of the reasons I really like it, though.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Special moment, yeah.
Perhaps, building on what Ruben was just saying, it's funny how a detail will take you somewhere else, a different time period, a different city. How has the city itself changed in the intervening years? I mean, how was it to shoot in the, in the 70s, 80s, as opposed to shooting today, on the street today?
Well, it's... I've seen a lot, being around a while, and it's hard to tell if I'm just bored by the way the city became. There's a lot of sameness and a lot of the originality and the difference that you used to see and the mixture of people and all the businesses that gave a neighborhood life, and they've disappeared. So. And all the stores start looking alike, the facades. I don't know, I think, nothing draws me the way it used to, really. There are still, every once in a while I see something interesting that's, makes you take a second look. But a lot of it I find, it's not that it's too safe, but it used to be a lot more gritty and a lot rougher and a lot more affordable. And all those things kind of add up to a very different city.
Sort of like piggybacking onto that, I mean, there's a lot today with never mind walking around with an iPhone, but with like a real camera of people like, you know, looking at you like, you know, hey, what are you doing? You know, you're in my face. And just feeling less invisible with a camera to catch those special moments. You know, do you feel that sense of things when you're out and about looking?
Thank you. I forgot all about how that annoys me. No, you know, the iPhone, it also takes like some of the joy away from me because everybody's photographing something and there are cameras everywhere. And I think, well, what am I going to add to this? Or why should I even do this? And people have tried to say, well, you know, you got your own vision, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know. It changes something for me because everybody's got it documented already. And I really don't know if it makes it easier or harder to photograph on the street. I just don't find that much I'm interested in enough of the time to get out and photograph a lot.
Hi, Arlene. I saw in a lot of your shots you had, you know, it looked like just to be one light source. So I wanted to know if you were shooting just with flash. Was it a flash on the camera, or did you kind of, you know, rig stuff? And then I wanted to know if you now shoot digital and if you've embraced that, or are you still shooting on film?
Well, I'll answer that one first. I'm still shooting on film. I don't work enough digitally to really learn it, and I don't know, when I tried to take a few classes and it's like in one ear and out the other, and I don't feel comfortable using it, so I don't really do too much digital. I have one small digital camera. I think it's great, you know, for the immediacy, but I think for me the film was something you could hold and look on a light box or look at your negatives, and I know where they were. They're not just in a cable somewhere or whatever. I like that. I like being able to have them, you know, be able to look at them and hold it in my hand. Otherwise, it becomes a different kind of venue. I don't know. As I said, I haven't done enough of it to really know if I want to work that way or not. Oh, and the flash, well, a lot of it was with flash that was inside, for sure, because I had to have a flash. I was shooting a lot of Kodachrome 200, and I still needed the flash to get fill, even if there was a lot of ambient light. I still felt like I needed the flash. So I had it on camera, mostly. The portrait of them all kind of falling over and laughing, that was done with big lights, because I was trying to get their album cover, but anyway, so my friend assisted me, and we used big studio strobes for that, but otherwise not, you know, just an on camera.
Hey, Arlene.
Oh, hi, John. How are you?
I'm okay. You're sort of the consummate New York photographer, and I mean, you clearly have this interest in the other. You know, you have these worlds that you would never find yourself in if you weren't curious, like the choirs, and then, you know, how did you meet midnight? You have this curiosity, but did you ever consider or want to photograph outside of New York?
I traveled a bit. I photographed. Sometimes I get a good picture from someplace else, but it seems like the New York stuff has the most connection. It seems like, I don't know, they work together as a body of work. And the other stuff, I don't know, you know, as I said, there's so much of it in other pictures. And, you know, if I was invited to Texas or what, you know, or goes to show my work someplace, I would, of course, see things and take pictures, but sometimes they're good, sometimes I think they're dull. I don't know. I get a few every once in a while, but I don't really work with them. They're in a file. There's a lot of that. Just like I said about the black and white, I would have never thought there was a book. You know, it was just sitting in boxes in the closet, literally. I never thought there was anything to it. Maybe I showed a few of them you know, at some exhibition, and then I just forgot about it, you know, doing other things, trying to earn a living, which was a crazy time in itself. Sometimes I think, like, what was I doing, you know? But I guess trying to pay the rent, you know. At least you could get a few jobs then. I don't know what it's like now.
Hi, Arlene.
Hi.
I'm having basically two questions. The first one is, many of these pictures were taken in the 80s and the 90s. So I'm wondering, did you find that the subjects at that time were more willing and more open towards having their picture taken? So that's the first question. The second question is, how was your interaction with the subject? Did you direct him in a certain positions, or was it usually or very often just a one-off, catching the moment, and then you walked on?
Well, I try not to manipulate it, even with my family, that of course they knew me, you know, and we were in the same place. I never really posed them necessarily, or I would say, just wait a minute, you know, maybe if there was something that I wanted to capture. But most of the time, I even with Midnight, I mean, we were friends, we hung out, we went everywhere, Coney Island, you know, Staten Island, all these fancy places that I like to go. And, you know, if I turned and I saw him doing something, I would take a picture of him. He was very, very attractive person and a very interesting, funny person. So I don't know, sometimes I ask less. I used to ask more early on, because I was using a slow camera that you had to focus, and sometimes I would ask people. But I don't do that. Now I do more candid stuff where I'm just trying to get them as they are before they could strike a pose. I don't really like that.
I'm curious about something. Even your website sort of advertises you as the singing photographer, and you've mentioned something about that. But is this a bigger part of your practice, or, I mean, the music? Because I'm just curious how that sort of title came.
My mother found out I was singing in a choir, and she called me the singing photographer. And then when work was slow, and there's that little space on the computer where you put in your business, so I thought, okay, I'm just putting in singing photographer. It was like, you know, if you don't like it, too bad. Like, what are you doing for me, and what am I doing? You know, it's just. The singing was big when I was in the choir, and then I went to different groups after that disband. But that was really a very high time, very passionate, very intense time. And I was singing a lot. And then I wound up in different groups, and for some oddball reason, I became a soloist, because I developed a big voice, and with the help of Selwyn and the gospel choir, the Eternal Light. And then I wound up at Middle Collegiate Church. They had a gospel choir there, and I wound up singing there for years. And it was a blessing. It was really great. But I'm not doing it as much now. I work with a piano player now, just to keep working a little bit and not let the voice disappear totally. But it's not the same as being in a choir, going weekly and then having to be somewhere and singing, you know, for a service or whatever, you know, whatever it was. Gay pride parade on the, you know, whatever. We used to go on a truck in the parade. It was crazy. Anyway. I'm hoping to publish Mommy, another project that I've been trying to do, and actually got postponed and almost 10 years went by, and it was sitting, and it's not an easy thing to do. I'll just say that much. It's certainly not the way I've done it. I wouldn't recommend it, but I'm grateful for the photographs I did take that are, at least some of them I'm proud of and I think are strong. And the ones, like Ruben said, that stand out. And I guess they'll endure with time. Those images are meaningful.
You can't find it anymore. You can't.
It's changed. It's kind of all disappeared. I guess that's what history's about, isn't it?
How and when did you get into photography or get interested?
Well, that's a funny event as well. My parents wanted me to go to college, and I hated high school. I was like just going through the motions. I barely got grades high enough to pass, but I got out of there. And then I took a job. I was a typist clerk in Times Square in a company. And I left there after a while because I saw that was going nowhere fast. And my parents, as I said, they wanted me to continue on. So I had the job during the day, and I took one night course. And it was my mother who said, well, maybe something in art. You know, if your mother doesn't know you, then who knows you, you know? So I went to the school, and I was looking for something to sign up for, and I saw photography, and I thought, well, I know with photography you have to do something. It's not just sitting listening to a lecture, which I could not do anymore, you know, or do homework like written reports and all, oh my God, you know. So that's what happened. I took a photo course, and it was actually a 4x5 black and white course where, you know, you developed the 4.5, and you did a lot of studio work with lighting. And I was, you know, as different as it is today, I was the only woman in the class. And when I walked in, there were all guys there and just me. And I got a lump in my throat like I wanted to cry. You know, it was like, oh my God. And now it's totally a different world, but it wasn't back then. So that's how it started. I took a photo course, and then I left that college, and I went to FIT, and I took a 2-year course in photography, which was basically commercial photography. And then I went to work for, if I could get an assistant job, I did that. That was not easy as well. They didn't think women could do the work or carry the equipment, and they didn't really want to hire me. One guy, European guy, he hired me. I was very surprised. You know, you're always surprised, like you're trying to get work and trying to get things started, and one day the phone rings and you can't believe it, you know, like somebody's really calling, and it seems so peculiar. All of it seems odd, yeah. Philip?
I notice in your pictures of family, I notice in your pictures of your family that there's somebody conspicuously absent.
For coming.
Was that your choice or his choice, your brother?
Well, I have him in pictures, but he didn't want to be in the finished work. At least at the time, he didn't want to. So I left him out.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned that you don't really do a lot of planning through
Yeah,
your
I'm not a
shoots.
good manager, planner, any of that. Wow.
So could you explain a little how you go from project to project and how your workflow goes in your shoots?
Well, a lot of it, you know, I was doing assignments, so that, you know, you get a phone call, you have to start running around like mad, organizing yourself, you know, your equipment and getting the information. That's one thing. But these things I was doing were on my own time, and as I said, about midnight, I never thought that I even had a project. I thought, well, you know, I have some nice portraits of a good-looking man in the shoebox. Is what I really, you know. So I didn't know. Really, for most of it, like the black and white, I used to just enjoy going places and making photographs at the clubs and the beaches, different block parties, different events, and I never thought of making a project out of it or anything, you know. And then The Eternal Light, because I had such a powerful relationship, they became my first publication. And I had to get a publisher all the way in England. Nobody would touch it in America.
Hey, Arlene, do you sing jazz?
Jazz, I can, but I mean, I have, but I'm not going to start singing a song now.
Just checking.
I wish I was more prepared for that, but I'm not going to. What was that? Try?
Well, Arlene, thank you so much. That was a great
Thank you
lecture,
for
great
having me
talk.
at SVA. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for coming.